early hours of June 13th, 1994, Los Angeles was still wrapped in the uneasy quiet of a city that never truly sleeps. The night air was heavy with summer heat, the kind that hangs over Brentwood like a blanket of still electricity. At the end of a quiet cul-de-sac on Bundy Drive, two bodies lay in the small courtyard of a condominium. One slumped near a gate. The other collapsed at the base of a narrow pathway. The crime scene would soon become one of the most infamous in American history. Nicole Brown, Simpson, 35 years old, mother of two, lay lifeless in a pool of blood. Nearby, Ronald Goldman, a young restaurant waiter, had been brutally attacked while apparently returning a pair of eyeglasses Nicole's mother had left at the restaurant where he worked. The violence was sudden, personal, and overwhelming. What began as a local homicide would soon spiral into a national obsession, a story of celebrity, privilege, race, and justice, colliding on a scale America had never seen before. The media would descend on Los Angeles like a storm. The names of everyone involved would be seared into public consciousness, and at the center of it all stood one man. Orenthal James Simpson, O.J. Simpson, one of the most famous athletes in American history. To some, O.J. was a hero, a football legend, an actor, a man who had transcended race and risen to the pinnacle of fame. To others, he was something else entirely, a man whose charm masked a darker truth. When police began to connect the evidence, a trail of blood, a missing glove, a white Ford Bronco parked outside Simpson's Rockingham estate, suspicion turned rapidly into accusation. Within days, Los Angeles found itself holding its breath as detectives pieced together a narrative that seemed both unthinkable and inevitable. At the time, America was already tense, the wounds of the Rodney King beating in the L.A. riots were still raw. Trust in law enforcement was fragile. In that climate, the murder of a white woman and a white man, allegedly by a black sports icon, became more than a criminal case. It became a mirror, reflecting the deep fractures of race, class, and celebrity in American life. As the case unfolded, every detail seemed to echo beyond the courtroom. The blood evidence, the DNA, the famous white Bronco chase that brought highways to a standstill and televisions across the country to life. Millions of Americans watched as O.J. Simpson, the smiling face from Hertz commercials, the beloved running back who once danced across football fields, sat accused of slaughtering the mother of his children. The trial that followed would become known simply as the trial of the century. It would pit prosecutors against one of the most powerful defense teams ever assembled. It would expose the inner workings of the Los Angeles Police Department, challenge the reliability of forensic science, and ignite fierce debate across dinner tables, newsrooms, and city streets. But behind the spectacle, the cameras, the celebrity lawyers, the courtroom theatrics, there was something more intimate and devastating. 2 people were dead. 2 families were broken. 2 children, Sydney and Justin, had lost their mother in the most violent way imaginable. The world wanted answers. The media wanted a villain. The nation wanted justice, though few could agree on what justice meant anymore. As the evidence began to surface, as the testimonies clashed, and as the public divided itself into camps, he did it versus he was framed, a strange and haunting question began to linger beneath it all. How had it come to this? How had a man once celebrated as the embodiment of the American dream, charismatic, accomplished, adored, become the central figure in a story that would redefine the meaning of guilt and innocence in the modern age? In the quiet before the storm, before the choppers filled the sky and the tabloids printed headlines that sold by the millions, there was only the scene at Bundy Drive, the flickering police lights, the shocked neighbors standing barefoot in the street, the stillness of early morning, broken only by whispered disbelief. Nicole Brown, Simpson's life had ended brutally, abruptly, at the threshold of her home, the same place where she had once sought safety from a man she feared. The investigation that followed would uncover years of tension, abuse, and control hidden beneath the surface of fame and glamour. And as the city woke that morning, it didn't yet realize it was standing on the edge of a cultural earthquake, one that would shake not only the lives of those involved but the entire nation's faith in truth, justice, and the very idea of equality under the law. The evidence would be overwhelming and uncertain all at once. The courtroom would become a stage, the lawyers its actors, and the nation its audience. Yet behind all the noise, one haunting question would remain. What really happened on Bundy Drive that night? Before the tragedy, before the headlines and the cameras, there was a love story or something that looked like one. In 1977, when O.J. Simpson first met Nicole Brown, he was already a household name. At 30, he had retired from professional football, transitioning seamlessly into a career as a sports commentator and actor. His charm was magnetic. He was the smiling face on television, the man who could light up a room, the embodiment of success and ease in a country still wrestling with its racial boundaries. Nicole was 18, young, beautiful, working as a waitress at a Beverly Hills club called The Daisy. Blonde hair, blue eyes, soft laughter. She grew up in a comfortable California suburb, the daughter of a close-knit German-American family. To the outside world, she seemed to have stepped straight out of a sunlit postcard. Their first meeting was, by all accounts, electric. O.J. was captivated. He pursued her with the intensity of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. Nicole was drawn to his confidence, his energy, his fame. Within a few years, they were inseparable. At first, life seemed charmed. They moved into the world of the rich and celebrated lavish parties, luxury cars, designer clothes. Photos from that time show wide smiles and tanned skin, moments frozen in golden California light. To the public, they were glamorous, a modern fairy tale. But beneath that surface, cracks began to appear. Those close to Nicole would later say she confided fears that O.J. could be jealous, controlling, unpredictable. There were whispers of arguments that turned physical, of bruises hidden beneath makeup. By 1985, they married. The ceremony was beautiful, but even then, some friends sensed unease. That same year, Nicole wrote in her diary that O.J. had become possessive and frightening. In private, she endured outbursts that grew in frequency and intensity. In public, they smiled for the cameras. In 1989, police were called to the Simpson home after a violent argument. When they arrived, they found Nicole bruised and terrified. O.J. was arrested for spousal abuse, later pleading no contest to misdemeanor battery. He was sentenced to probation, community service, and counseling. Yet for many, the incident faded quickly, overshadowed by his fame. America wasn't ready to see its heroes as villains. Their relationship continued in cycle separation, reconciliation, and the quiet, painful rhythm of denial. They divorced in 1992, citing irreconcilable differences. Nicole began rebuilding her life in Brentwood, focusing on her children and her independence. Friends described her as radiant, determined, finally free. But O.J. struggled with that freedom. He called often, showed up unexpectedly, professed love, demanded attention. There was a sense that he couldn't let her go, that beneath the charm and the polished exterior, a storm brewed. Nicole's friends noticed changes. She spoke of fear, of strange noises outside her home, of feeling watched. In her diary, she wrote that she was afraid O.J. would kill me someday and get away with it because of who he is. The years between their separation and her death were marked by an uneasy dance of proximity and distance. They attended their children's events together. They spent holidays as a family. To outsiders, it looked like reconciliation, but inside, Nicole's anxiety grew. Los Angeles in the early 1990s was a city of contrasts, glittering wealth beside deep inequality, celebrity culture against a backdrop of racial tension. In 1991, the Rodney King beating had torn open long-suppressed anger toward the LAPD. The riots that followed left scars still visible years later. Trust in law enforcement was fractured, especially among Black communities. O.J. Simpson, however, seemed untouchable. He lived behind gates in a mansion on Rockingham Avenue, surrounded by friends, fans, and the comforts of wealth. His charisma had always been his shield, a bridge that crossed race, class, and privilege. But that image was built on performance, a balancing act between the man he wanted the world to see and the man he was at home. Nicole tried to move forward. She took care of Sydney and Justin, built a close circle of friends, and enjoyed her independence. Her townhouse on Bundy Drive was cozy, decorated with warmth and a touch of elegance. It was a place of laughter, of small dinner gatherings, of ordinary happiness. Yet, even there, fear lingered. Neighbors would later recall seeing OJ's white Bronco parked outside late at night, hearing raised voices, sensing tension that didn't belong in their quiet street. Nicole's calls to friends were filled with uncertainty, love, and fear entangled in ways she couldn't untie. By June 1994, she was 35. Her life was full but fragile. She had dinner plans, errands, playdates with her children. There was no reason to think anything extraordinary awaited her that Sunday night. Ron Goldman, too, lived an ordinary life, earnest, kind, working to make ends meet, while pursuing dreams of modeling and acting. He knew Nicole casually, through the restaurant where he worked. That night, fate or something crueler would bring their paths together. In retrospect, the story feels like a slow-motion tragedy, a sequence of moments where intervention was possible but never taken, police reports ignored, cries for help dismissed, a culture too dazzled by celebrity to look too closely. The world saw O.J. Simpson as the American dream, personified a man who had risen from poverty to fame, transcending barriers others couldn't. But behind closed doors, the reality was darker. A marriage steeped in fear, control, and violence. By the summer of 1994, the tension that had simmered for years was nearing its breaking point. Nicole's diary grew more desperate, her friends worried, and somewhere, in the quiet spaces between fame and infamy, a decision perhaps conscious, perhaps born of rage, was waiting to be made. The stage was set. Two lives, intertwined by past love and present fear, were about to meet their violent end. And when it happened, the shock would ripple through every layer of American society, from the quiet streets of Brentwood to the steps of the courthouse to living rooms across the world. The murder of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman would not only expose the fractures in one family, it would open wounds in a nation that had long pretended they were healed. Sunday, June 12, 1994. The sun had dipped below the palm-lined streets of Los Angeles, and Brentwood glowed with the soft orange hue of twilight. It was an ordinary summer evening, warm, calm, deceptively peaceful. Nicole Brown Simpson's day had been full, the kind of domestic rhythm that makes life feel reassuringly stable. She'd spent the afternoon at her daughter's dance recital at Paul Revere Middle School, where both Sydney and Justin performed. O.J. Simpson was there too, seated a few rows away. Those who attended later said the two had barely spoken. To onlookers, they were just another divorced couple maintaining civility for their children. After the recital, Nicole returned to her home at 875 South Bundy Drive. It was a modest townhouse compared to O.J.'s sprawling estate, but it was hers, her refuge. She planned a simple evening dinner at Mezzaluna Trattoria, a cozy Italian restaurant just a few blocks away. She went with her family, her mother, her sister Denise, and others. It was casual, relaxed. Waiters remembered Nicole laughing, sipping wine, a woman enjoying a quiet night after a busy day. Working that night was a 25-year-old waiter named Ronald Goldman. He was friendly, fit, and energetic, known among regulars for his easy smile. Nicole's mother, Juditha, accidentally left her reading glasses at the restaurant. When she realized, she called, and Ron offered to drop them off on his way home. It was a small, kind gesture, one that would cost him his life. Around 9:35 p.m., Nicole and her family left the restaurant. She drove home, unaware that her night would end in horror. Surveillance cameras captured O.J. at his Rockingham estate roughly half an hour later, preparing for a red-eye flight to Chicago scheduled for just after midnight. What happened in the narrow window between 9:45 and 10:15 p.m. would become one of the most dissected timelines in modern criminal history. Neighbors on Bundy Drive recalled hearing a dog barking incessantly, a large white Akita, around 10:15 p.m. It belonged to Nicole. One witness, a man walking his own dog nearby, noticed the Akita wandering agitatedly, its paws stained with something dark. The dog eventually led him back to Nicole's front gate, where the horrific scene awaited. Nicole's body lay just inside the courtyard, her throat cut so deeply it nearly severed her head. She had multiple stab wounds to her neck and torso. Nearby, Ronald Goldman was sprawled at the base of the steps, also stabbed repeatedly. signs of a violent struggle evident in the overturned plants and smeared blood along the walkway. There were no signs of forced entry, no robbery. The killings had been fast, brutal, personal. At approximately 12:10 a.m., police responded to a call from neighbors reporting a disturbance. They arrived to find the scene illuminated by flashlights and disbelief. The small, gated path leading to Nicole's condo was slick with blood. The air was heavy with the metallic scent of violence. Detective Tom Lang and his partner, Detective Philip Vaneter, were called in. They immediately noted the sheer ferocity of the attack. Nicole had been barefoot, dressed casually as if she'd stepped outside for only a moment. Goldman's position suggested he had fought back, possibly arriving just as the assault began. Then came the first clue that would shift the investigation's direction. Near Nicole's body lay a single dark leather glove, soaked in blood. As officers canvassed the area, they noted Nicole's 2 young children asleep inside, untouched, unaware of the horror just yards away. They were gently carried out and placed into police protective custody. When detectives began identifying the victims, they quickly realized the gravity of what they were dealing with. Nicole Brown Simpson, the ex-wife of O.J. Simpson, one of the most recognizable figures in America, officers drove to O.J. Rockingham Estate to inform him. It was now shortly after 4 a.m. The gate was locked. Lights dim. Detectives scaled a wall to enter the property, finding O.J.'s white Ford Bronco parked askew outside. On its driver's door, faint smears of what appeared to be blood. A few moments later, they were met by Cato Kalin, a houseguest staying in a guest house behind the main residence. Kalin mentioned he had heard thumping noises earlier that night around 10:40 p.m., coming from the side of the house near his room. When detectives investigated that area, they found the second glove, a near-perfect match to the one at Bundy Drive. It, too, was soaked in blood. O.J. Simpson was not home. His housekeeper said he'd left for Chicago on a late flight. By sunrise, the city was alive with whispers. The name, O.J. Simpson, appeared in police notes, not as a victim or a witness, but as a possible suspect. In Chicago, detectives reached O.J. by phone, informing him of Nicole's death. His reaction was recorded as one of shock and disbelief. Though some officers noted he did not immediately ask how she had died. He returned to Los Angeles that same day. By then, investigators had already begun connecting the dots. Drops of blood led from the Bronco to the house, from the driveway to the entryway, from the glove to O.J.'s bedroom. Inside, police found bloodstains on the floor and in the master bathroom. O.J. claimed he had cut his hand the night before, a minor injury from breaking a glass. But the explanation didn't match the amount of blood found. As word spread, reporters swarmed Brentwood. Helicopters hovered overhead. The names Nicole Brown Simpson and O.J. Simpson appeared on every front page. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, detectives began to assemble what looked like an overwhelming case. Blood evidence matched both victims and O.J. Simpson. Hair and fibers found on the glove and cap near the crime scene were consistent with his. Shoe prints near the bodies matched a rare Bruno Magli brand, the same type O.J. was known to wear. To the LAPD, it seemed clear. O.J. Simpson had murdered Nicole and Ron in a fit of jealous rage. But to others, especially within the black community, the picture was not so simple. After decades of racial injustice, the idea of the LAPD framing a successful black man was not unthinkable. By June 17th, 5 days after the murders, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office issued a warrant for O.J. Simpson's arrest. He was to surrender by 11 a.m. that morning. He didn't. Instead, what followed would become one of the most surreal moments in American history, a televised spectacle that would blur the line between news and entertainment, tragedy and theater. At around 6:20 p.m., viewers across the country watched as a white Ford Bronco drove slowly down Interstate 405, trailed by dozens of police cars and news helicopters. Inside were O.J. Simpson and his friend Al Cowlings. O.J. was in the back seat, reportedly holding a gun to his head. People lined the overpasses, waving signs, cheering, holding banners that read, "Go O.J." and "We love you." It was part chase, part pilgrimage. After nearly 2 hours, the Bronco finally pulled into Simpson's Rockingham estate. He surrendered quietly, ending one of the most bizarre days in American television history. By nightfall, O.J. Simpson was booked for the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The trial that followed would not only determine his guilt or innocence, it would tear open the nation's soul. The morning after the Bronco chase, the city of Los Angeles awoke to a strange calm. The chase had been surreal. A man once adored by millions, pursued live on television, his face flickering across every screen in America. But now, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind an ache of disbelief. At Parker Center, headquarters of the LAPD, detectives sifted through an avalanche of evidence. The narrative, to them, seemed straightforward. They had two victims brutally murdered in a scene soaked with rage. They had physical evidence that appeared to connect directly to O.J. Simpson. And they had a motive: jealousy, control, obsession. From the beginning, investigators zeroed in on the blood evidence. It was everywhere, a trail that led from Bundy to Rockingham, from the Ford Bronco to O.J.'s bedroom. In 1994, DNA analysis was still relatively new to juries, but the technology was already reshaping the world of forensics. Tests showed that blood found at the crime scene matched both victims and Simpson himself. The probability of those genetic markers belonging to anyone else was staggering, 1 in several billion. The glove recovered at Bundy and the one found behind O.J.'s guest house were the same make and model. Dark brown leather, size extra large. The left glove bore traces of Nicole's and Ron's blood, along with fibers from a rare carpet type used in O.J. Bronco. The right glove, discovered at Rockingham, carried similar evidence, the biological fingerprints of all three. Then there were the shoes. Investigators had cast impressions of bloody footprints at the scene. The pattern matched a Bruno Magli Lorenzo-style shoe handmade in Italy, priced at over $400 a pair, and sold in only a few dozen stores across the U.S. When detectives later found photographs of O.J. wearing the exact model at a football game, the evidence seemed damning. But as solid as it appeared, something else began to stir beneath the surface. Distrust. The LAPD's history of misconduct was no secret. The Rodney King beating just 3 years earlier had shredded public faith in the department, especially among black Angelenos. For many, the idea of the LAPD planting or manipulating evidence was not a conspiracy, it was a memory. At the center of that storm was Detective Mark Fuhrman. He was the officer who discovered the crucial glove at Simpson's estate. Initially, he was seen as a diligent investigator. But whispers began to surface, whispers that Fuhrman had a history of racist remarks, that his credibility might not withstand scrutiny. When those allegations came to light, they would shake the prosecution's case to its core. As police built their narrative, O.J.'s defense team was already assembling a fortress. It was a lineup unlike any the country had ever seen, a dream team of lawyers led by Robert Shapiro, joined by F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, Barry Scheck, and a charismatic attorney named Johnny Cochran. Each brought their own specialty: forensic analysis, legal strategy, emotional appeal. From the moment O.J. pleaded not guilty, the battle lines were drawn. The prosecution, led by Marcia Clark and Christopher Darden, argued that the evidence told a clear story, a crime of passion committed by a man who refused to accept rejection. They would paint O.J. as an abuser, a man whose charm masked a violent temper. The defense, meanwhile, would counter with a narrative that resonated deeply in the American psyche: that O.J. Simpson, a successful black man, was being targeted by a racist police department determined to destroy him. While the lawyers prepared, the media turned the case into a spectacle. The 24-hour news cycle was still in its infancy, and this was the perfect storm: fame, race, sex, and murder colliding in one courtroom. Every day, viewers tuned in as if watching a serialized drama. In the weeks following the arrest, detectives continued gathering evidence. They subpoenaed O.J.'s phone records, studied his movements on the night of the murders, and scrutinized every minute of the timeline. At 9:36 p.m., a limousine driver named Alan Park had arrived at Rockingham to take O.J. to the airport. Park waited outside, ringing the intercom repeatedly. There was no response. Around 10:40 p.m., he saw a figure tall, wearing dark clothing, moving across the driveway and entering the house. Minutes later, the lights inside flicked on, and O.J. finally answered the intercom. He claimed he'd overslept. To the prosecution, that unexplained gap, the missing hour, was everything. It was enough time to drive to Bundy, commit the murders, and return. Then came the cut on O.J.'s left hand. Officers noticed it during his interrogation. He said it had happened accidentally while breaking a glass in his Chicago hotel room, but the timing, again, was suspicious. The blood trail from his hand was already on the Broncos' console before that trip even began. Every piece of evidence tightened the noose, and yet the case was far from bulletproof. The handling of the crime scene raised doubts. Some blood samples were collected days later. Evidence bags were left unsecured. DNA was transported in ways that would later allow the defense to argue contamination. And then there was public perception. For many white Americans, O.J. Simpson was guilty, the evidence overwhelming. For many black Americans, the case symbolized centuries of injustice. A chance to watch the system that had long oppressed them finally sweat under scrutiny. The courtroom, still months away, would become a battleground for more than one man's fate. It would be a reckoning for the nation itself. In those early weeks, the investigators pressed on, unaware that their own missteps, a dropped sample here, a careless word there, were sowing the seeds of doubt that would later bloom into one of the most controversial verdicts in history. As summer turned to autumn, the case file grew thicker, the pressure heavier. The prosecution was confident. The DNA was irrefutable, they thought. The glove, the footprints, the timeline, it all fit. But behind closed doors, Johnny Cochran was preparing a counterstrike that would redefine courtroom strategy forever. He knew that the truth in a courtroom wasn't about science, it was about belief. And belief could be shaped, molded, dramatized. By the time the trial began, the nation was already divided. The courtroom became a stage, and the world watched as two competing narratives, one scientific, one emotional, began their collision. The search for truth had started. But truth, as America was about to learn, is rarely pure and never simple. January 24th, 1995, the people of the state of California v. Orenthal James Simpson. A trial unlike any before it, one that would turn a courtroom into a theater and a nation into a divided jury. By now, the world was transfixed. Cameras rolled daily as the proceedings unfolded in Los Angeles County Superior Court. Presiding over it all was Judge Lance Ito, a calm but often overwhelmed figure who tried to keep order amid chaos. Every moment was televised, every gesture analyzed. When O.J. entered the courtroom, calm, stoic, impeccably dressed, it wasn't just a defendant walking in. It was an icon. A man who had once represented America's boundless optimism. Now he sat accused of the unthinkable. The prosecution began with cold logic. Marcia Clark laid out a narrative that was heartbreakingly simple. O.J. Simpson, enraged by jealousy and unable to let go, murdered his ex-wife and an innocent bystander. She spoke of domestic abuse, control, and the illusion of the perfect man. Her voice trembled with restrained anger when she reminded the jury of the 1,989 police report, the one where officers had found Nicole battered, trembling, and terrified. It didn't start that night, Clark said. It ended that night. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA. Forensic experts testified that the probability of the blood at the scene belonging to anyone other than O.J. Simpson was less than 1 in 6 billion. Photographs of blood trails, glove fibers, shoe prints, and hair samples were shown in painstaking detail. But the defense, led by Johnny Cochran, understood something the prosecution underestimated: the jury's perception. The jury, composed predominantly of black men and women from Los Angeles, viewed the case through a different lens. Many had experienced or witnessed police misconduct firsthand. To them, the LAPD was not a trusted institution. Cochran and his team knew this and crafted a story not just of one man's innocence, but of a system's corruption. They called it reasonable doubt, but it was more than that. It was emotional resonance. The defense began chipping away at the credibility of the LAPD, focusing especially on Detective Mark Fuhrman. Under questioning, Fuhrman denied ever using racial slurs in the past decade. But soon, tapes surfaced recordings from interviews he had done years earlier filled with racist language, boasting of violence against black suspects. The revelation detonated like a bomb in the courtroom. Suddenly, every piece of evidence Fuhrman had touched was suspect. Cochran seized the moment, looking directly at the jury as he asked, "Can you trust a man who calls black men animals? Can you trust him with the truth?" The prosecution's once airtight case began to fray. Then came one of the most infamous moments in courtroom history: the glove demonstration. The prosecution believed they were making an irrefutable point. They asked O.J. to try on the gloves, the very ones found at Bundy and Rockingham. In front of the jury, the cameras, and millions watching at home, O.J. struggled to pull them on. His hands appeared stiff, the gloves tight, unwilling to fit. He flexed his fingers, grimacing, as if to show they were too small. In that instant, months of forensic evidence seemed to crumble. When Johnny Cochran stood before the jury in closing arguments, he delivered a line that would echo through history. "If it doesn't fit, you must acquit." It was more than rhetoric. It was a masterstroke of psychology, a single phrase that distilled reasonable doubt into something unforgettable. The trial dragged on for nearly 9 months. Expert after expert testified, often confusing the jury with scientific jargon. The DNA evidence, though compelling, was buried beneath endless explanations about contamination, collection procedures, and mishandled samples. Meanwhile, the media circus outside turned the courthouse into a carnival. Reporters from around the world fought for interviews. Talk shows debated guilt and innocence. Celebrities took sides. Late-night comedians joked about it, while activists used it as a platform to discuss race, gender, and justice in America. Every day, as O.J. sat quietly at the defense table, the cameras lingered on his face, searching for guilt, for grief, for anything that revealed the truth. Behind him, his family and friends formed a small, loyal wall of support. Among them was Robert Kardashian, who had once been O.J.'s closest friend. He looked haunted, uncertain, a man torn between loyalty and conscience. The longer the trial went on, the more it stopped being about Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. The victims' names faded from headlines. The story became about the system, about power, privilege, and race. For Nicole's family, it was agony. They watched as their daughter's memory was overshadowed by spectacle. For Ron Goldman's parents, it was unbearable, their son, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now a footnote in the drama of another man's downfall. When the trial finally reached its end, the closing arguments felt like the climax of a movie America had been watching for nearly a year. Marcia Clark pleaded for justice. She spoke of Nicole's fear, her diaries, her bruises, her attempts to escape. "You cannot let him get away with this," she said. "You cannot tell her children that this is how justice works." Cochran rose to respond. His voice was smooth, resonant, filled with the rhythm of a preacher. He spoke of history of distrust, of police corruption, of systemic injustice. "This case is not just about one man," he said. "It's about whether the system can be trusted when it points its finger at a black man." On October 3rd, 1995, the jury delivered its verdict. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty on all counts of murder. Outside, cheers erupted from many black neighborhoods across America. In others, particularly white communities, disbelief and outrage filled the air. Offices, classrooms, and homes were divided. It was as if the nation had split down an invisible line: one verdict, two realities. Inside the courtroom, Nicole's and Ron's families sat motionless, faces frozen in grief. For them, there was no victory, no justice, just loss and the unbearable knowledge that the man they believed had killed their loved ones would walk free. O.J. Simpson smiled faintly, exhaling a deep breath as if the weight of the world had lifted. For him, it was vindication. For others, it was proof that fame and race had bent the scales of justice. The trial had ended, but the story was far from over. In the years that followed, America would continue to wrestle with what it all meant, how one case could expose so much about who the country was and who it wanted to be. For a time, the world tried to move on. The cameras left the courthouse. The headlines shifted, but the shadow of the trial lingered like smoke. It had been more than a verdict, it was an event that changed how America saw itself. Yet for the families of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, there was no closure. To them, justice had not been served. They lived each day with the quiet torment of unanswered questions, of truth slipping between the fingers of law. In the aftermath, O.J. Simpson returned to a life that was no longer his. The world he'd once ruled, the red carpets, endorsements, adoring fans had vanished. He retreated to his Brentwood estate, surrounded by loyal friends and a shrinking circle of believers. The smile that had once been his armor now looked hollow. Uncertain, the court of public opinion had replaced the court of law, and in that court, O.J. was guilty. Sponsors dropped him. His public appearances were met with protests. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now a ghost walking through the ruins of his own legend. But the story didn't end there. In 1996, the families of Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman filed a civil lawsuit against Simpson, seeking damages for wrongful death. Unlike in criminal court, the burden of proof was lower preponderance of the evidence, not beyond reasonable doubt. This time, the cameras were fewer, the tone quieter, but the atmosphere heavier. The civil trial revisited every dark corner of the case, and without the same theatrics, the evidence spoke more clearly. Blood patterns, DNA, timelines, all of it was laid bare once again. The defense no longer had the momentum of racial politics or the theatrical force of Cochran's courtroom charisma. Instead, there was something rawer, more human, a search for accountability. In February 1997, the jury reached its decision. They found O.J. Simpson liable for the wrongful deaths of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. He was ordered to pay $33.5 million in damages. The verdict couldn't bring the victims back, nor could it erase the years of spectacle and pain. But for the families, it was something, a formal acknowledgement of the truth they had known all along. For O.J., it was the beginning of a slow, inevitable descent. Financially, he was devastated. His fortune drained through legal fees, damages, and the collapse of his reputation. His properties were sold, his memorabilia auctioned off. He moved to Florida, seeking a state whose laws would protect his home from being seized to satisfy civil judgments. But peace never came. Over the years, O.J. lived as an exile of his own creation, attending autograph signings, living off fading fame. Chased by the echo of his past, he gave interviews insisting his innocence, wrote a book titled If I Did It, and continued to provoke the public with a mixture of defiance and denial. Each appearance reopened the wound. The world that had once adored him now watched with detached curiosity, the way one watches a fallen star flicker on the edge of extinction, and yet the fascination endured. The O.J. Simpson case had become more than a tragedy. It was a lens through which America saw itself. It revealed the fragility of truth in the face of fame. It exposed how race could divide perceptions so deeply that two people could look at the same evidence and see entirely different realities. It turned the justice system into entertainment, and entertainment into justice. Years passed. The trial became a cultural reference, then a case study, then a cautionary tale. The jurors spoke of pressure, of confusion, of doubt. The lawyers became celebrities. Johnny Cochran's famous line entered the lexicon. Marcia Clark left prosecution behind, scarred by public scrutiny that was often crueler than the case itself. But perhaps the most haunting aftermath was not legal, it was emotional. Sidney and Justin Simpson grew up in silence, their mother's memory frozen in photographs, their father's name forever tied to her death. They were children of a tragedy that never let them go. Ron Goldman's family became relentless advocates for victims' rights, turning their grief into purpose. They spoke often, with quiet fury, about the difference between justice and truth, how the two could coexist and yet never meet. And O.J. He continued to live a paradox, a man free, but imprisoned by his own story. In 2007, more than a decade after the murders, Simpson was arrested again, this time in Las Vegas. He and a group of men had entered a hotel room armed, attempting to retrieve sports memorabilia he claimed had been stolen from him. The incident, though far removed from Bundy Drive, seemed like a dark echo of his past, impulsive, reckless, born of entitlement and rage. This time, there was no dream team, no national debate, no moral spectacle. The world had moved on. The trial that followed was swift, decisive, and unsparing. In 2008, O.J. Simpson was sentenced to up to 33 years in prison for armed robbery and kidnapping. The irony was inescapable. He had escaped conviction for murder, only to be imprisoned for theft. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was quiet. There was no cheering, no outrage, only a strange, exhausted sense of inevitability. Years later, when Simpson was granted parole, he walked out an older man, his swagger diminished, his fame now a ghostly echo of a time the world wished to forget. But even then, the question lingered. Had justice ever truly been served? The truth of that night on Bundy Drive may never be fully known. What is certain is that 2 lives were ended, 2 families shattered, and a nation forced to confront its own reflection. A reflection distorted by race, fame, and the fragile faith it placed in the system meant to protect it. Forensic experts still debate the evidence. Documentaries revisit the details, probing for something overlooked, but each retelling feels less about O.J. himself and more about the world that made him, a world where celebrity could shield a man and prejudice could obscure the truth. Nicole Brown Simpson was more than a name and a headline. She was a daughter, a mother, a friend, a woman who had tried to leave an abusive marriage, who had sought peace and found violence instead. Ronald Goldman was more than collateral damage. He was kind, selfless, a man whose final act was one of compassion, returning a forgotten pair of glasses. Their lives deserved to be remembered not for the circus that followed, but for the humanity stolen from them that summer night. And O.J. Simpson? He remains what he has long been, a riddle carved into American history, a man who stood at the crossroads of truth and illusion, forever blurred by both. Decades have passed since the murders on Bundy Drive, yet their shadow still stretches across the American psyche. The O.J. Simpson case remains an open wound, a story too complex to heal, too public to forget. Time has softened the faces in the photographs, but not the questions. In classrooms, in documentaries, in quiet conversations about justice and race, the case still returns not merely as a legal drama, but as a parable of who America was in the 1,990 seconds, and perhaps who it still is. For some, O.J. Simpson is a symbol of guilt unpunished, a man whose fame and wealth shielded him from accountability. For others, he stands as proof that a black defendant could finally triumph over a justice system that had, for generations, done the opposite. And for many, he is simply a tragic figure once adored, now remembered with pity and discomfort, a warning about power, ego, and the fragile veneer of celebrity. But beneath the noise and endless retellings, there is a quieter truth. This was never only O.J.'s story. It was Nicole's. It was Ron's. It was a story about how love can decay into obsession, how institutions fail those who ask for protection, and how a nation's fascination with fame can drown out its empathy for the dead. Nicole Brown Simpson had tried to escape. Her diaries revealed her fear of control, of humiliation, of the day her ex-husband's anger would finally consume her. She called the police repeatedly. She confided in friends. She hoped, as so many victims do, that love might transform the man she once adored. Instead, it destroyed her. Ronald Goldman was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or perhaps in the right place doing the right thing. His kindness, his courage, his ordinary decency, all of it led him unknowingly into a tragedy that would immortalize him. Their names became inseparable from O.J.'s, their humanity buried beneath the spectacle. Yet every retelling, every courtroom transcript, every documentary trying to untangle fact from feeling, ultimately leads back to the same simple, human truth. 2 lives ended brutally, and 2 families left to carry the weight of that night forever. The trial itself marked a turning point in American culture. It was the birth of the televised courtroom, the rise of the 24-hour media cycle, the blurring of law and entertainment. It taught networks that crime could be spectacle, that tragedy could be profitable. It turned grief into programming. Millions tuned in daily, not to mourn but to watch, to argue, to take sides, and in doing so, the trial revealed something about the audience as well, a hunger for drama, a fascination with downfall, and a deep, unresolved discomfort with race and privilege. The verdict, when it came, did more than acquit a man. It split the country in 2. Surveys at the time showed the divide in brutal clarity. Most black Americans believed O.J. was innocent. Most white Americans believed he was guilty. The line was not about evidence, but experience. It was about history, the memory of injustice shaping the perception of truth. That fracture did not vanish with the closing of the courtroom doors. It still echoes in every high-profile case where race, class, and law intersect. The O.J. Simpson trial was not just a mirror of its time, it was a premonition. Today, when people speak of it, they often do so with a tone of disbelief not only at the verdict, but at how much of themselves they saw reflected in it. The trial was not simply about guilt. It was about identity, about who gets believed, who gets forgiven, and who gets condemned. For O.J. Simpson himself, the years that followed became a long, slow, unraveling. Prison, obscurity, a legacy too poisoned to reclaim. The man who once ran toward the end zone with the grace of a mythic hero now walks through history as a symbol of downfall, a cautionary tale of ego, violence, and denial. In the end, his story became inseparable from the questions it raised. Can justice survive celebrity? Can truth withstand bias? Can a nation divided by history ever agree on what it sees? There are no simple answers. If you visit Brentwood today, Bundy Drive looks almost unchanged. The hedge has grown taller, the street quieter, the world beyond it louder. Passers-by might not even realize what once happened there, that on a warm June night in 1994, the illusion of perfection ended, and America's faith in its own reflection began to crack. But for those who remember, the ghosts remain. In the stillness of that courtyard, one can almost feel the weight of all that followed: the flashbulbs, the headlines, the shouting matches across television screens. It began there, with 2 lives taken, and ended somewhere far beyond in the collective memory of a country that couldn't look away. The O.J. Simpson case was more than a murder trial. It was a story about fame, fear, and the fragile boundaries between love and possession, truth and performance, justice and illusion. It was a story that forced America to ask not only what happened that night, but who we became because of it. And perhaps that is its most haunting legacy, that even after all the evidence, all the words, and all the years, the question remains suspended in the air. Was justice done? No one can answer it without revealing who they are, because the truth, as the O.J. Simpson case taught the world, is not always found in verdicts. It lives in memory, in conscience, and in the uneasy silence that follows when a nation decides to stop asking.